Welcome to Tough Talk. I'm your host, Paul Taros, and today my guest is Candius Stearns, who is the owner of a health insurance agency and the Republican nominee for Michigan's 9th Congressional District. Welcome, Candius.
Thanks for having me on today, Paul.
So I want our viewers to know I did reach out to your opponent, Andy Levin, to have him on the show. One time, one of my phone calls was not returned at all. Second time, I talked to a staff member, presented the invitation. I was told they'd get back to me, but they never did. So
yeah, that's been my experience as well when I asked for a debate, actually. So,
okay. So Andy Levin is running to replace his father, Congressman Sander Levin, and is the nephew of former U.S. Senator Carl Levin. With that kind of pedigree, isn't it going to be pretty tough for you to beat him?
well, I get this question a lot, mostly because, of course, the Levin name is what I consider a political dynasty here in Michigan. But through all of the discussions that I've had, knocking doors and meeting with the people in the district, the general consensus has really been that people are tired of the same old, where we send someone to Washington and they're more concerned about DC photo ops and talking points than doing what's actually right for the people here in Southeast Michigan. And I've been a small business owner and working in the community with my own insurance agency for almost 25 years. So I've been making payroll, balancing a budget, hiring and offering jobs to employees here locally. So I really think I have the kind of experience that the people here in the Michigan 9th really would like to see go to Washington so we can get some results done.
Okay. So since Andy is not here, I went on onto his campaign website and picked a few of his positions, and I will read them to you, and you can comment on them.
Sure.
Okay. Medicare for all. Healthcare is a human right, period.
Well, as far as healthcare and what he and I have views on, we actually differ quite a bit. As I mentioned, I've been in the insurance world for almost 25 years, and although there are some parts of the Affordable Care Act, like pre-existing conditions not being applied to individuals and people being able to keep their children on their health care until age 26, that have been very beneficial for not just people here in Southeast Michigan, but people all across the country. There were a lot of things that the ACA did, quite frankly, adding a tax, many different kinds of tax to health insurance. As well as forcing plan parameters and telling us exactly what we needed to have purchased when it came to health care, that have been very detrimental to the way our health insurance works. But the ACA, in my opinion, was really more of insurance reform, and it didn't really deal with the problem or the concern that we have with actual cost of care. It didn't force prescriptions to lower, and it didn't really do anything to make the cost of care transparent. In fact, our current system makes it very difficult and challenging for a patient to know what we're actually going to have to pay for a procedure. And that's really a shame, and really one of the things that I'm going to do in Congress once elected, which is help bring down the cost of prescription drugs, as well as make the cost of medical care transparent, so we know exactly how much it's going to cost prior to a procedure, and hopefully spur on more of a free market system, which is what's really needed in healthcare.
Okay, well, great ideas. I mean, we really do need more transparency. I would certainly like to know the cost of procedures before I go see a doctor.
Exactly, and I think we all deserve that.
Okay. Taxes, and these are Andy's words, not mine. The GOP tax plan was not a reform, it was a shakedown. corporations and the richest 1% of Americans will reap most of the benefits, while working families got tiny cuts that expire after several years.
Well, I don't agree with his comments about how the American people aren't seeing any kind of benefit. I live in Sterling Heights, and the people in my district are seeing lower taxes through their paychecks, so they're actually bringing home more take-home pay. And not only did businesses get assistance as well as the individuals, but by lowering the tax, it's actually helped spur on the economy, and that's why we're seeing our gross domestic product at 4.2%. And we're seeing Fiat Chrysler bringing jobs into Warren Truck here, because as we've seen in the past, when you actually lower the cost and put more money back in the hands of the working people, they spend more dollars and actually help grow the economy. So we just have very different views on how tax is levied and what it actually does for those of us in the working class families.
Okay. Now on the issue of trade, and again, these are Andy's words, not mine. Mm-hmm. We need to crack down on dumping, currency manipulation, theft of intellectual property, and other violations by China and others who do the same. Let's change our tax policies to incentivize creating good jobs at home and increase job training and apprenticeships.
What's interesting about that statement specifically, and I was at a trade forum this morning with the Sterling Heights Chamber, is that I think that's what our current administration's doing, is that right now our president is trying to negotiate fair trade, and even my 11-year-old David can tell you what fair trade is. When you're at school trying to swap one cookie for a ho-ho and not saying carrots are exactly what an 11-year-old would consider fair trade. And so I really think that's what our current administration is doing. With what they're trying to accomplish with China specifically. I know in the short run we've had concerns, obviously, with steel. I have a couple of clients in the steel industry that were concerned. I also am the daughter of a crop farmer, and so I understand the plight of agriculture and what's, some of the concerns that have been going on with the tariffs. But we have been at an unfair advantage for quite some time, and I applaud our president for actually trying to do something about it. The NAFTA deal, it looks like we're going to have some kind of reworkings with both Canada and Mexico here pretty soon, and I think we actually are moving forward to make more reciprocity in what is called fair trade, not necessarily free trade. And fair trade means that we actually will have not only a lower tariff or a more reciprocal situation, but when things get exported into another country, we're not going to have to worry about that country then putting tax on that product to make it less desirable for their people to purchase things that we export, for example.
Okay. On the issue of guns, and this is Andy again, as a person of faith, I'm sick of hearing the thoughts and prayers coming from the very people who are supposed to take action. Congress does nothing because the Republican Party is beholden to the NRA. Well,
I have two boys. As I mentioned, David, 11, who's a 6th grader, and my oldest, who's a sophomore in high school. And I've been very concerned with, the shootings and all of these different things that have happened over the last even 6 months. So I do have a heart and a concern for our young people and these violent acts that are going on, whether it be in schools or we just celebrated a unfortunate terrorist attack with the hotel that happened at Mandalay Bay area on October 1st. And we do have a lot of gun control laws that are on the books, and we do have background checks and a lot of things that are currently in place, and I think we need to do a better job of policing those particular laws that we have in place, and we need to have a more transparent discussion and interaction between information with the FBI, local police, and those kinds of things, so that we can help make sure guns don't get into the hands of these mentally disturbed people, for example. We also, I think, need to make sure that these gun-free zones are fortified, and that we actually have resource officers and people to help protect our schools. And along with that, I think having single points of entry and some of the other recommendations that our law enforcement have provided, not only our public school districts, but also private schools, because my kids happen to go to a private school, and they're looking at these ideas that law enforcement are recommending too. And I think those are ways that we should handle some of these problems and challenges that we have.
Okay. Continuing on the topic of guns, Andy writes, we need universal background checks, gun violence restraining orders, a new assault weapons ban, and a bump stock ban, and more.
Sure. Well, again, I would point that we do have a lot of these laws that are currently in place. We just need to make sure that they're followed and the laws are actually being utilized. When it comes to an assault weapon, what's interesting, because I happen to be an owner of firearms. I'm part of the Huntsman Hunt Club, and I actually shoot pheasant with my boys and my husband. And assault weapons and the way they're defined as semi-automatic and versus automatic is a very fine line. And so you have to be very careful on how you choose to use words and how the words are defined, and blanketly saying we need to ban all assault weapons or semi-automatic weapons could mean that you're banning my shotgun, quite frankly. So we do need to have a lot of discussions around guns and gun safety, because when you own a gun, you need to make sure you have proper safety mechanisms in place, and you have a gun safe in your home, like I do, for example. But we also have to be careful not to trot on the Second Amendment rights. And I think some of these knee-jerk reactions that we flock to whenever there's a massive unfortunate shooting or something of that nature is exactly that, sometimes a knee-jerk reaction, and we need to really look at solid ways to protect our people, but also allow for our Second Amendment rights.
Okay. Now on the issue of education, again, Andy writes, we must invest in higher education so students aren't buried in debt when they graduate. I support free community and four-year college for poor and working class students, and many reforms for wealthier students who need to take out loans, including lower interest rates, loan forgiveness for public servants, returning loan servicing to the government from big corporations, and more. In addition, public colleges need better funding to improve instruction and graduation rates.
So I do agree that, for example, Michigan's ranks 46th when it comes to reading proficiencies of fourth graders. And so we do need to look at our education system and make reforms. How we go about doing that, however, I think my opponent and I might have different views. I also agree that we need to encourage apprenticeship programs and marry small businesses with not only community colleges, but also our high schools. When I graduated from high school at L'Anse Creuse North in Chesterfield Township in Macomb County, I was part of a Pankow vocational school where I learned how to design on AutoCAD, and that actually provided me a wonderful paying job of $13 an hour right out of high school. And it also afforded me the ability to pay my way through school, so that I did get some scholarship dollars and things like that, which afforded me to go to the community college at Macomb Community College, where I got my associate's degree. But there was no rush for me to get in debt, because I knew I could work and pay my way through school. And so I think we need to do a better job of helping our young people get on a track earlier in middle school, for example, in high school, for their higher education. And sometimes that will mean going on to a 4-year university, but I also think sometimes that'll mean that you're going to go into more of a vocational school, and we need to do a better job of helping ferret that out at a younger level in our public and private schools.
Okay. On the topic of Social Security, again, Andy writes, Republicans try to scare people into thinking Social Security can't be fixed because they want to privatize it. But we can make modest tweaks to ensure the solvency of this program for decades and decades to come, including raising the wage cap to ensure that the wealthiest Americans are paying their fair share.
Well, again, I think we have different views on how we can fix some of these issues right now. If we don't look at how the dollars are being spent that are coming in for Social Security, for example, we're going to bankrupt that fund, because dollars, unfortunately, that have been put into that account in that bank have been used for other things. Part of fixing our Social Security issues and Medicare for that, discussion too, is for us to actually look at making sure we're spending dollars appropriately, that we're stopping wasteful spending, fraud, and abuse in these different programs. And I think along with that, and providing alternative options for people who are paying into Social Security, we can get it on the right track. So again, we both, I think, agree that there's a problem. Just how we go about fixing it is completely different. And taxing the rich to give to the poor isn't going to work in an overall scheme of things.
Okay. On the issue of environment, Andy writes, more than 40% of major industrial facilities in Michigan are spewing large volumes of pollution into our rivers and lakes, violating the Clean Water Act. Unfortunately, we can't count on the Trump administration to stop the pollution. So
obviously, as a farmer's daughter, I've always had a love for not only the land and the water, but the Great Lakes growing up here in Michigan. And because I'm a proud supporter of agriculture and tourism, I do agree that we do need to evaluate how we look at government pollution type regulations and things of that nature. The unfortunate part of putting in a Clean Water Act or any type of legislation is it's enacted in this example, 1972, and then isn't reviewed or updated on a regular basis, because it takes an act of Congress to make changes. So whenever we put in major acts and major pieces of legislation, I think we need to always go back and review those pieces of legislation to make sure that they're keeping up with the current situations. For example, we now have PFAS and these other things in Michigan specifically that are being investigated, and we're needing some type of guidance on the parts per million or the parts per trillion that our medical people feel is appropriate to have in the waters. So I'm definitely one for making sure that our regulations are appropriately applied from a state and federal level. But when we start enacting things on a federal level, we need to be careful to ensure that they can be reviewed and changed as our environment changes.
Okay. I can't help but wonder, where was President Obama and Andy's father and uncle all these years?
Well, and that's the problem that I think happens when you have political people that stay in office for 43 years or 36 years. There's no sense of urgency. There's usually a lot of partisan bickering that goes on back and forth. And I'm running, obviously, as a Republican, but because I'm a small business owner, I'm used to seeing results and working towards a specific goal so that we have a measurement of what we actually get done. And I think it's well needed in Congress right now for people to actually say, here's what we're going to do, and this is how we're going to get it done. Let's sit down at the table, agree to disagree on the things that we don't have common agreement on, and then actually push bills through and agree on what we do so that we can have results for the American people instead of stagnant periods of time where nothing gets done.
Okay. Continuing on the topic of environment, Andy's website says, above all, we must address climate change with tremendous urgency. Saving our planet and our people from global warming is a moral imperative, but it's also an economic opportunity. I created Lean and Green Michigan to help businesses and nonprofits retrofit their buildings for energy efficiency, water efficiency, and renewable energy like solar.
Well, I think you can have both. When we talk about renewable energy and fossil fuels, there's this visceral gut punch that occurs where it's like you have to pick a side, and there has to be a winner and there has to be a loser. And when I've met with Consumers Energy and the different folks at DTE, for example, we've discussed how it's not an either or. You can actually have both. You can actually put together an energy policy where you utilize all of your resources. And so I just fundamentally disagree with the idea that we have to pick a winner or a loser in these kinds of things. And that's just how I'm going to make sure we move policy forward when I'm in Congress.
Okay. On the issue of women's health, otherwise known as abortions, Andy writes, while the Trump administration tries to turn the clock back 50 years on women's autonomy and reproductive rights, I will fight for the rights of women to make their own choices concerning their bodies and reproductive health.
So, as a woman, I consider my reproductive health to be mammograms and preventive care and a lot of female doctor visits versus just the one blatant discussion about whether or not I should be allowed legally to have an abortion. And so I dislike this tying that occurs with women's rights, women's medical rights or reproductive rights as being considered health care, because most of us go to the doctor annually for checkups to screen for cancers and all of these other kinds of things, which are extremely important for all of us to have access to. Those of us who don't have insurance or who are underinsured, for example. And as a woman, I strongly support ensuring that we have access to this kind of care. When it comes to abortions, however, I happen to be a pro-life candidate, and I personally don't believe that abortions are for me, for example. So that's just how I feel about that. And when they talk about women's reproductive rights, for example, I think the other side tends to lump all of those things into women's health care, and I just think that's fundamentally dishonest.
Okay. Before I talk about Andy's next idea, I want to give a brief description of what postal banking is. Basically, it is allowing approximately 30,000 post offices to engage in retail banking and offer low-cost loans similar to payday loans. Mm-hmm. So Andy, on protecting consumers, he writes, postal banking would give everyone in the United States easy access to simple checking accounts and banking services from a source they can trust, not to rip them off. It will make banking services available in rural and poor communities that are not profitable for conventional banks. Your thoughts?
Well, I'm not sure that offering an additional way to bank from what we have currently in place is necessary. I mean, we have your credit unions, we have your regular banking institutes, and quite frankly, I don't know that there's a giant concern for folks to have another banking system in addition to the channels that we have today. So, you know, I know it sounds like he's concerned about people having access to loans and credit and things of that nature, but they can have access now, and so I'm not sure having to add more bureaucracy to our current system is the answer. I think we need to clean up our current system and make sure that it's fair for everyone, regardless of their credit scores and things of that nature, so they have access to credit, of course. But adding another arm into it, I don't think is necessary.
Okay, but don't you think that somebody with a lower credit score should pay more in interest? I mean, it's a higher risk loan.
So if you have declared bankruptcy and things of that nature in the past, and you've had a hard time repaying a loan, I absolutely think a bank or whoever the creditor is should have the ability to factor in that risk. You know, absolutely, I agree with that. And so, you know, that's why I don't think we need to have an additional system put in place from our existing system.
Okay. Well, with that, we're going to have to wrap it up, but I wish you much luck on November 6th.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate being on today.
Thank you.